Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Across the nation, Confederate flags and symbols are beginning to disappear, 150 years after the end of the Civil War and 50 years after the Voting Rights Act. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Backlash began in earnest with the shooting deaths of 9 African Americans in a Charleston, South Carolina church. The alleged shooter was seen in photos of himself with the Confederate flag. And that has set off a movement not thought possible even a year ago. But since then, the Confederate flag in front of the South Carolina State House has been taken down at the behest of its Republican governor, Nikki Haley. Numerous states have decided to strike the Confederate symbol from license plates, and the statues of Confederate soldiers are being questioned. Many of these actions are being taken by Republicans who have based much of their political dominance in the post-civil rights era on a Republican solid South. This morning we want to take a look at this shift and explore its meaning as the nation grapples with its past. In our studio is Joshua Wright. He's an assistant professor, social science department at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you so much, Don.
Well, let me ask you this. First of all, what do you think has sparked this sudden change, not only by Democrats, not only by people who perhaps might be expected to, but a whole range of, for instance, Republicans, who, as I noted just a moment ago, really based much of their dominance, at least since 1964, on this solid South that was once part of the Confederacy.
Right. I mean, I think it's just people not wanting to be caught on the wrong side of history. This debate's been ranging on for more than a decade now, but with the shooting this summer and the fact that you had these 9 innocent people who were murdered in this church, I think that this was something that it was easy for the nation to kind of come together on and say, hey, maybe we should take this flag down.
Let's step back a little. This flag has really 2 major events. Obviously, the first is the Civil War, and then also it's utilized again in the opposition to civil rights.
Right.
Give us a sense of history about this flag.
Okay. So the Confederate flag it's a very interesting history. So if we start back with the Civil War, we know Lincoln gets elected into office in 1860. Then we have Southern states succeeding. December 24th, 1860, South Carolina releases what's called the Declaration of Causes for Secession, all right, in which they lay out basically a proclamation saying that we feel as though our state rights to have slavery, which is what's controlling our economy, is being violated by Abraham Lincoln, it's being violated by the North. You'll have other southern states, such as Mississippi, following suit with similar proclamations. You also have the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who gives what's called a cornerstone speech, which is going to be later in March of 1861. Again, saying the same thing, and he's also saying that the South is going to form its own separate nation. All right. Civil War happens, as we know. The Confederacy ends up losing the war. We then go into a period of Reconstruction for about 12 years, 1865 into 1877. With the conclusion of the Reconstruction period, you'll start to see Southern Democrats regaining power. Blacks who did gain rights temporarily during the Reconstruction period lose that power. There's also going to be a push at this time for capturing the memory of the Confederacy. Like, how will we remember this war? Because initially when, like they say, to the victor goes the spoils, when the war comes to a conclusion, Southerners feel as though, they're made to almost feel shamed for what happened during the war. The Confederacy is viewed as not only losing the war, but they're also viewed as being immoral. And anything that's associated with the Confederacy, including a flag, is going to be a symbol of shame. When we talk about the Confederate flag, it's important to note that the flag everybody knows now was not the original flag. It wasn't even the main flag of the Confederacy. The Confederacy had 3 different flags. All right. The earliest version was called the Stars and Bars. And if you think about our current American flag, it looks a lot like the Stars and Stripes. And they had to change the flag because in some of the earliest battles, the soldiers couldn't tell which flag was which because they looked so similar. Following the stars and bars, you get another version which is called the stainless banner. And then finally you get a third version called the bloodstained banner. Again, none of these flags are actually the one we know today. You will see a symbol that looks similar to that flag, but the actual flag we think of now was the battle flag for Northern Virginia, which was Robert E. Lee's army. After the war, after the Reconstruction, as I say, there's this push to change the memory of the war, all right, basically revisionist history. The flag starts to become important. They adopt the Robert E. Lee flag from Northern Virginia, and you'll have groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which gets formed, the Sons of the Confederacy, who say that we want to make sure that our ancestors get their proper due in history. We want this flag to be a sacred symbol, something that we pull out for special ceremonies, dedications, to help us honor our past.
Now, some people observe that the South basically lost the war, but it regained the peace through both the pen and the noose, and that they were able to reconstruct this idea of particularly the flag as a symbol almost of patriotism, which originally it was really a symbol of treason. I mean, Dr. James Lowen, professor from the University of Vermont, actually said that in an article for the Washington Post, where he says the South lost the war, as you said, but they won it through the pen. All right, and this is where we bring it back into this issue of the memory, how we remember the war. Excellent book for all your listeners is Race and Reunion by Dr. David Blight, where he basically says that after the war you had two groups. You had one group which was called your emancipationists, those people who were solely pushing for civil rights, black equality, etc. Then you had another group which was called reconciliationists, who were focused more so on bringing the North and the South back together, and more so like Northern and Southern white men and white women together. You also would get this push for something called a lost cause mythology. The lost cause is very key. Like whenever we think about the way the Confederacy is remembered, the meaning of the flag, the reason why certain people in our country view it one way and others view it a different way, comes back to this lost cause. With the lost cause, it says that basically the South lost the war, but they lost the war not because they were bad people, not because they were immoral. They lost the war simply because they were outmanned. The North had more soldiers, they had more equipment, more railroads, etc. They lost the war because, they just got beaten. I mean, plain and simple. But with the lost cause myth, it says that slavery had absolutely nothing to do with the war. And this is really important because you hear people who say, I'm holding up my Confederate flag. It's not a symbol of hate, it's a symbol of Southern pride. And that is true because under the lost cause, this whole war was about Southern nationalism. Again, we're breaking away from the Union. The Southerners viewed themselves like the American colonists during the Revolutionary period, where as colonists we felt as though our rights were being trampled upon by the British. We needed to form our own nation. In the South, they felt as though their rights were being trampled on by these northern invaders, by people like Abraham Lincoln. And it's important to note that, when Lincoln comes into office, the fear is that he wants to end slavery. He wants to change society, change their way of life, change their economy. That's not really what Lincoln was pushing for, though. I mean, Lincoln's whole view of blacks and equality changes over the course of the war up until his assassination. As early as 1858, when you had those famous Lincoln-Douglas debates that took place, Lincoln was saying that, I believe in free soil, free labor. So in other words, these new territories that we have out west, territories we've won from war with Mexico, we're going to keep those free of slavery because we want that to be land that free white men can go when they could work and they could have their families settled there. We don't want it to be like the South. But Southerners heard that to say, hey, this is going to be, it's basically a domino effect. It starts out in the West, but then eventually it's going to move to the Southern states as well. Southerners, again, we're feeling as though their way of life was being trampled. So the war becomes a revolutionary war, their Second American Revolution. And also, what seems to develop, at least up until about the 1964, was basically the Democratic Solid South. But in what I found fascinating, particularly about American political history, is that in 1964, you see a very strange thing occur, which was that Johnson, who obviously wins by a major electoral landslide, he loses the deep solid South.
Yeah.
That the Republican Party, which starts out with Lincoln, seems to shift.
Yeah. And I mean, one point I wanted to make, just to finish up on my last point, and then I'll come back to the shift in the Republican Party. Again, as we start to get into the 20th century, we're going to start to see textbooks changing, particularly in the South, in terms of how they're teaching the war. We're going to see pop culture and Hollywood start to play a big role as well, where you have films like Birth of a Nation, which gives a completely Confederate view of the Civil War and of Reconstruction, where Lincoln is cast as the villain, the African American politicians are cast as the villains as well. The KKK, they play the hero role in this film, and Birth of a Nation, which comes out in 1915, is the very first major Hollywood film. Up until that point, all of our films were about 10 or 15 minutes in length. Then you get Gone with the Wind, later in 1939, again, continuing to put out the Southern mythology, right, the Lost Cause mythology. In other areas of Southern society, such as sports, you're going to start to see Confederate flags being displayed at games and fraternities. So this is how, the whole Southern nationalism is starting to really, overtake the South. Now, to go back to your question about the shift in the Republican Party, when you think about the Civil War era, you think of the Republican Party being the party of the North, the party of Abraham Lincoln. When we went into Reconstruction, you had a group of people within the Republican Party in Congress who were called the Radicals, the Radical Republicans, and they were the ones who pushed to get a 14th Amendment passed, giving citizenship rights to African Americans, and now obviously citizenship rights to everybody. They're the ones who passed the 15th Amendment for voting rights for black men. The Democratic Party was associated with the South, and when Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, we call this the redemption, because the Southern Democrats regain power. How do they regain power? It's a few different ways. Number one, you're going to have terrorist groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, being formed. They use intimidation methods to fear or to scare not only the free black voters, but also those northern white voters, people who were, derogatorily referred to as carpetbaggers, to scare them from going to the polls, to scare off those Southerners as well who might have been supporting the Republican Party. You're going to see Northerners start to shift their attention back to other issues besides the South and besides slavery and emancipation, and basically say that what we need to focus more so on is economic issues and just, again, bringing the North and the South back together. So the Democratic Party basically regains control of the entire South, all right? Up until about really Franklin Roosevelt's election in the early 1930s, this is when you're going to start to see this shift slowly, where we think of the Democrats now as being the more liberal party, the party that African Americans tend to vote for, will shift with Franklin Roosevelt. And, when we get into the Great Depression, the New Deal era, and this is funny, and this is another myth, a lot of people think that Franklin Roosevelt was pro-civil rights, pro-African American. In actuality, he wasn't. He was concerned with keeping his Southern base intact, all right? There were lynchings that were happening rampantly after, you get into about the 1880s through the 1930s. You had 4,000 people who get lynched, 4,000 African Americans who are getting lynched. And you had black civil rights leaders who were pushing the Roosevelt administration to have an anti-lynching bill. And Roosevelt didn't want to sign it because he didn't want to lose that Southern base. He needed the support of Southerners in Congress to get all of his New Deal legislation passed through. But it was his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a champion for, women, but also a champion for African Americans. And because she formed those relationships within the black community, that's when black voters started to come to the Democrat Party in large numbers. And then you start to get that association. And then, after Roosevelt, you'll see Harry Truman, who ends up integrating the military. So again, now you have this association of, okay, the Democratic Party, these are the more liberals. The Republican Party, these are supposed to be the ones who are opposed to civil rights. Now, you do still have factions within the Democratic Party, throughout the 1950s, or really starting in the late 1940s, who are still kind of tied back to that old school Civil War era Democrat, because you think about the Dixiecrats. And this is how we could bring the Confederate flag back into the discussion, because the Confederate flag becomes a symbol for the Dixiecrats. You think about people in the 60s like Governor George Wallace of Alabama, Ross Barnett of Mississippi, people who were strongly opposed to integration of universities in their states, strongly opposed to civil rights. They were tied into that old school Southern Democratic mindset.
So at that point, what was the decision-making process, do you think, for the Republican Party to make this shift? And how do these symbols play into that?
Okay, so when we talk about the shift, are we still dealing in the 1960s?
Yeah, the 1964 period where you get the shift. I mean, because I know Strom Thurmond played a key role. For instance, he was the Dixiecrat, as a matter of fact, presidential candidate in '48, I believe it was. But he plays a role in Nixon's nomination, actually, in that convention. What's going on here? Why is it that the Republican Party found it so easy to shed its traditional constituency?
Right. Well, one of the things I think, you have to look again at the fact that African Americans are starting to come more and more towards the Democratic Party. The Democrat Party's reaching out to blacks, is dealing with their issues. You think about, if we go back to the 1950s and we look at Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower comes into office, you have Richard Nixon as his vice president. You have this major conflict that's taking place in Little Rock, Arkansas, the famous Little Rock 9 incident in 1957. Eisenhower was seen as a moderate, on terms of civil rights, meaning he wasn't totally opposed to it, but at the same time, he wasn't a strong advocate for civil rights either. When the Kennedys come into office, John F. Kennedy, his brother, in 1960, they kind of say, okay, we're going to take on this platform of civil rights. We're going to reach out to Dr. Martin Luther King. There was a famous incident where Dr. King gets jailed, and you have Robert Kennedy calling to say, hey, get Dr. King out of that prison. They're reaching out. So you look at the opposite party, the Republicans, they're saying, okay, well, if you guys are going to try to get this base of, African American voters, we're going to go back to our base of working class, middle America whites from the Northeast, from the Midwest, and particularly the South. And it's almost as though in the 60s, it's just really a nice shift where the Democrats become associated with all of this liberalism and all of the civil rights. You had a number of whites who were feeling as though, they're being left out. Like, what about, my needs? What about my issues? I'm not comfortable with Brown versus the Board of Education. Even though that's 1954, now we're talking 1964, I'm still not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with this school integration. And I have a candidate out here who's speaking up for my views, whether that's Barry Goldwater, whether that's going to be Richard Nixon, and it's that whole idea of this silent majority where they feel as though now we have somebody who's listening to us. And a lot of that, I guess you could call it racist rhetoric that people were afraid to say in public, the Republican Party, and I don't want to say everybody in the Republican Party, but, dominant figures within the Republican Party really took advantage of that in terms of trying to gain votes and gain political power.
So how do you assess this when you sort of move into the 1980s? How do you assess Reagan's role? Because Reagan, as a matter of fact, began, I believe, announced his presidential campaign, I think, in the town in which the 3 civil rights workers were killed. What kind of, was this a solidification, do you think, of then this process of not only for the Republican Party, but kind of the resurgence or dominance, political dominance by the South politically?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at Richard Nixon's presidency, he had strong support within the South. All right, then we get Jimmy Carter. First Gerald Ford, after Nixon, then Jimmy Carter, and then Reagan comes into office. And with Reagan, we think about the early 1980s as this Republican revolution, right, where Reagan is talking about Christian values, old school values. Let's fight communism, et cetera, but he's also reaching out to that same Southern white working class base that Richard Nixon was able to capture. Another thing about Reagan, Reagan was always, at one point he was a Democrat. Like early in life, he was a Democrat. He even supported Roosevelt. But, by the time Reagan is in office, not as president, but as the governor of California, he was a staunch opponent to some of the civil rights protests and activities that were taking place, particularly in his state. In California in the 1960s, when he's in office, you have a group like the Black Panthers, who was seen as more of a radical wing of the civil rights movement, and they were pushing for a number of things, such as attention to police brutality, the use of guns to protect African Americans. Ronald Reagan was opposed to the Panthers' use of guns. I mean, he helped to endorse what was called the Mumford Act, which was basically, banning the use of firearms in public, even if you had a permit for it. So, as early as the 60s, Reagan was, basically answering, I guess, I want to call it a southern base because in California you're out on the west, but, those people who would have been opposed to black power, who would have been opposed to civil rights, he was doing that as early as the 60s. So when he comes to office in the 1980s, it's just a continuation. You think about the main Reagan program, which he gets beat up on a lot from liberals, is the war on drugs, all right, where you start talking about tougher drug laws and tougher drug sentencing for powder versus crack cocaine, and the whole disparities where the powder cocaine users tended to be wealthy. I mean, you have blacks, but they tended to be wealthy blacks. In most cases, they tended to be whites, while the crack cocaine users tended to be the minorities, the blacks, the browns. You start to get an increase in the number of federal prisons that get built and developed, to the point where you get this prison industrial complex starting to form and really take shape by the time we get into the 1990s. But that starts with the policies Reagan was putting into place. You get attacks on affirmative action programs. All of these different things that to African Americans make Reagan and the Republican Party and everybody who says that we're the party of Reagan, make those people seem as though they're against us. That maybe these people aren't, meaning Reagan and his followers, maybe they aren't the Dixiecrats from the 1960s, but they aren't that much better. But to the working class whites, to Southerners, they love what Reagan is talking about. They love what Reagan's supporters are talking about, and this is when it really takes off in the 1980s in terms of the Republican Party becoming the party of the South and the party of the upper class, and minorities having less and less and less influence within the Republican Party.
Now, at this point, juncture, particularly in the 1990s, the issue of the flag comes back with Pat Buchanan, who runs against George Herbert Walker Bush, and there was a great debate about, I think it was the Georgia flag, or the South Carolina flag rather, talking about the emblem being put on all of these flags, which, and those, in my understanding, is the emblem of the Confederate flag in one fashion or another really came out of the 1950s. I mean, they weren't on those state flags until that period. But then you see where the Republicans are kind of dancing, saying to themselves, well, we think it's up to each state. I don't want to say it as a presidential candidate. So it sounds like there's some movement now going on where they're not ready to endorse it. On the other hand, they can't step away from that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the notion of popular sovereignty, right? It's a Civil War term. You think about, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where you say, okay, these people in this territory should have the right to choose if they want to have slavery or not. The federal government shouldn't step in and tell them they can't. That's the same thing you have happening here with these politicians in the modern era. Another thing, though, you mentioned the fact that you start to see the flags popping up on state house buildings and different emblems. So let's just go backwards for just a second. 1961, South Carolina puts the flag on top of their state capitol building. Now, why did they do that? All right, well, obviously it's the centennial of the Civil War. 1861 is when the war starts, so 1961, we're honoring the memory of the war. All right, and again, as I talked before about the lost cause, there's that tradition of honoring our Southern past, either through erecting monuments of Confederate soldiers, of naming certain highways after the Confederates, like the Jefferson Davis Highway, having events like these Confederate balls, etc. I was actually at Duke University for a little bit this summer, and their chapel, they have 3 statues for Confederates. Even today in 2015. So anyway, in 1961, South Carolina puts the flag on top of the dome. It's interesting that this is falling, at the same time when the civil rights movement, the modern day civil rights movement, is really starting to take off. You have the freedom rides happening at the same time in 1961. With South Carolina doing it, you're going to see other states, having the flag. As you said, Georgia has the flag, the Confederate emblem put on their state flag. And that stayed until 2003. Mississippi has the Confederate emblem put on their state flag, and that's still there, and there's still a debate as to if Mississippi should change it or not. And it's that same issue where some people say, yeah, we should, but then let's leave it up to the state and let them decide what's going to happen.
Yeah, because so at that point, I mean, there does seem to be some trepidation, but they're leaving it out. Now we're getting this situation where, particularly after, as I mentioned, the shootings in Charleston, is suddenly there is this almost, I mean, I read stories almost virtually every few weeks of someone either taking down a flag or taking down a Confederate soldier statue or Robert E. Lee statue or and so on. I mean, and I actually was quite surprised to find that there are so many of these these statues and flags around that one would not think, particularly, for instance, in the state of Maryland, which was with the Union, yet you see all these Confederate flags and statues.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, earlier we talked about Dr. Lowen from the University of Vermont. And, you know, one thing that he points out is going back to this point about the South winning the war with the pen, you know, and like these statues really symbolize that, because now you have states who weren't even in the Confederacy who have statues erected. Lowen talks about the fact that if you look at Kentucky, all right, which never actually joined the Confederacy. You know, I mean, like if you look at the flag, there are 13 stars, all right? There were 11 states that officially joined the Confederacy, and then you have 2 additional stars, and one of those stars is for Kentucky, the other one's for Missouri. Well, Kentucky, you had probably 3 times as many men who fought for the Union as who, you know, went off to fight for the Confederacy. But if you go to that state, there are a ton of Confederate statues. In Maryland is, you know, a really interesting state. A lot of people tend to think that Maryland was a part of the Confederacy just because of our location and, you know, where we are in relation to Virginia. But Maryland was called a border state. You know, we never actually joined the war, but it's important to note that Maryland was so significant. Like, there's a book by historian Barbara Jean Fields, which is called, I want to say it's The Civil War in the Middle Ground, and it talks about Maryland during the Civil War era. And she says that in Maryland, you had basically 2 sides. You had one side who supported the North, they supported the Union. You know, that tended to be Baltimore, those areas, while in parts of southern Maryland, you know, here on the Eastern Shore, you had a number of people who were actually sympathizing with the South and with the Confederacy. So in that sense, it's not really that surprising that Maryland would have statues for the Confederacy when you did have a lot of people here who actually supported, you know, what they were doing. Like, there's a statue that was erected at the courthouse in Rockville, Maryland. And actually this summer, I want to say like late July, after the shooting and all of the stuff took place, it got vandalized. And unfortunately,
right,
you know, I think somebody might have wrote Black Lives Matter or something like that on the statue. And, you know, there's been talk and debate about, you know, well, why do we even have this statue, and should we actually take it down?
So at this point, do you see this tradition of both the Confederate statues and the Confederate flag disappearing, at least from officialdom and from these squares? I mean, that it may very well be relegated to either obviously private museums or, in the case obviously of the shooter in Charleston, to very extreme right-wing groups. I mean, are we beginning to shed that symbol, or what do you think the future holds for that?
I think slowly. But I think it's going to be a while, though. I think right now you see a lot of debate because the issue is so current. You know, I mean, the shooting just happened a few months ago.
Right.
In South Carolina, South Carolina really didn't have that much of a choice. I think Governor Nikki Haley would have looked so bad in the public's eye had she stood up there and really continued to, you know, support it. Because keep in mind, South Carolina, like I said, they put that flag up on the dome in 1961. Now, they removed the flag because there was debate, right, from the NAACP, from local civil rights groups. There was a lot of debate taking place in the 1990s, and they ended up removing the flag from the dome in 2000, and then they put it on that flagpole. And it's still there for 15 years. Now, I'm sure you had people over the course of those 15 years who were saying, let's just get rid of it, period. But, you know, they were defending it. Even Nikki Haley was defending it up until that shooting. So I think that did spark a change. But I think, like most things, like after a certain period of time, it's kind of business as usual. I heard somebody, I know this is slightly off topic, but I heard somebody ask the other day, with the Pope coming to town, right? Everybody seems unified, and, you know, we're, you know, uplifted by his message, and he, you know, hit on a lot of different issues, social and political. but how much change do you see coming out of that? And the person's response was, I think initially, for the first few months, maybe even a year, there will be change. But then after that, it's going to go back to business as usual. And I kind of feel it's the same way with this Confederate debate. We will see like some flags get taken down. Maybe some statues will get taken down. But in terms of like if everything's going to go, it's going to, one, I don't think there'll ever be a day where everything is removed completely. But, I think it's going to take a while for this massive amount of change to really take shape. I mean, I mentioned the statues over at Duke University at the chapel. I'm pretty sure, there's probably a movement now, amongst the students to try to get that taken down. You had a dormitory at Duke that was named after a Confederate leader and someone who was in the KKK. And that dormitory was named that up until maybe 5 to 7 years ago. I don't know how long it took the students to get that changed, but it was there for a long time. You had a noose that was hung on Duke's campus back in the spring, and that's caused their campus to take race issues, a lot more serious and have forums. So maybe those forums could eventually lead to some of those statues coming down in their chapel. But I think it's going to take a long time, and my point is that I think it's going to be like that everywhere, where some things may come down. It's easy to take a flag down, but it's a lot harder to knock over a statue or to change the name of a highway like Jefferson Davis, or to change even, here's another point, like a lot of military bases are named after Confederate soldiers, all right? It is, let me see, just 1 second, because I wrote it down. I don't want to...
I think like Fort Bragg and...
I don't want to mess up the name, but you have... Fort Benning. Yeah, Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia, named after Henry Benning, who was one of the Confederate leaders from that state. You know what I mean? It's going to take a while for all of these things to change because it's so ingrained within the fabric of our nation.
Let me ask you one final question, and this is really goes to the issue of race and how whites and blacks see this thing. Because I ran across a quote from State Representative Mick Mulvaney out of South Carolina, knew one of the individuals that was killed in the shooting. And he said, quote, "I blame myself for not listening closely enough to people who see the flag differently than I do." Why is it, do you think, that whites and blacks see this flag so differently? Not just Southerners, but that when the two walk by the flag, they see different things.
I think it's because of our experience. And I don't want to make it a black-white issue, but I guess for the purpose of this, I will have to.
Yeah.
Like when blacks look at it, they think of a flag as being the symbol of the party or the government who wanted to keep slavery, during the war. They look at it as being the symbol of those people who were supporting groups like the KKK during the 1920s and 30s, the symbol of the Dixiecrats, the symbol of the people who were standing in front of schools, protesting, threatening to kill, little kids, right? Like Ruby Bridges, like a little girl trying to integrate a school. That's what that symbolizes to them. It's hatred, it's racism, it's oppression, otherness, meaning like blacks are the other, etc., right? With whites, it's different because, obviously, if you're from the South, you could talk about the whole idea of Southern pride, Southern heritage, but the flag has become such like a national symbol within popular culture where it doesn't even have the same meaning, right? Like there's a song by Brad Paisley, all right? This kind of captures this, all right? The song's by Brad Paisley, a country singer, and he's joined by rapper LL Cool J, who's African American, right? It's called Accidental Racist. And Paisley starts off by saying, I'm just a Southern man, I'm just a white man from the Southern land, I'm caught between Southern shame and Southern pride. Now, he says if I throw on a rebel t-shirt or a rebel hat, I'm not even saying that I'm supporting the Confederacy. I'm actually saying that I'm doing this because I support Leonard Skinner. Leonard Skinner, they have the flag on, their logos and at concerts. So this flag has become like this whole pop culture phenomenon now where you have groups like Leonard Skinner, Kid Rock, a rapper from Detroit who's kind of become more of a Southern rock star now. You had shows in the 80s and the 90s, the 80s like Dukes of Hazzard, with the General Lee. So the flag has become such a symbol in pop culture that people identify where it's really like a fashion symbol almost, where the history is totally gone. So it's easy for, a white person like Kid Rock, who's not even from the South, he's from Detroit, to adopt this and to say, hey, I support this, this is a cool symbol, and hey, I support the Southerners because they like my music too, But for black people, we can't see it that way. Now, you do have some blacks, because it's funny, like we had this debate in my class a few weeks ago, where you had some black students who were saying, you know what, I'm tired of this whole debate. Like, the only way we're going to get over racism and segregation is if we just kind of not forget about it, but let's just stop talking about it like every day. Who cares if you have a flag? As long as you don't do anything to me, then I don't really care. And even like in the song by Paisley and LL Cool J, you kind of get that same message, because LL Cool J comes in at the end of the song and he's rapping and he's saying, okay, this flag bothers me. However, if you could overlook the do-rag I'm wearing on my hair, then I'll overlook that red flag. And if you could overlook my gold chains hanging down my neck and don't judge me and think I'm a thug, then I won't judge you for the iron chains of slavery from the past and your ancestors. So you do have people, who feel that way. You do have some people who've even tried to change the meaning of the flag. Within the black community, Kanye West, so-called presidential candidate in 2020. That's a doozy. But anyway, Kanye West, back in 2013, actually started selling Confederate flag style t-shirts and hats and hoodies at one of his tours. And when they asked him, why are you doing this? He's like, well, I'm changing it. Like, back in the day, this was a symbol of racism, so now I'm totally changing it, almost like the N-word, where, it's not a hate symbol, it's a symbol of, brotherhood or friendship or whatever. But the problem, even with doing that, is the fact that you can't erase their history. Like, that history is always going to be there, and it's always going to be uncomfortable. And as long as that's the case, you're always going to have a majority of blacks who do have a problem with the flag. And you do have a lot of whites who see the flag as a symbol of treason. Even if they don't see it as a symbol of hatred, they see it as a symbol of treason. So, I don't want to blanket all whites and say they all just, are oblivious to what the flag means to African Americans, because that's not true, and that wouldn't be fair.
We've been speaking with Joshua Wright. He is an assistant professor in the Social Sciences Department at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and we appreciate you taking time to stop and talk with us about this.
Hey, thank you so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.